The night stretched endlessly over the empty highway, swallowing the asphalt in thick darkness. The distant growl of engines echoed through the cold air, growing louder with each passing second. Riley Thorne, a former military K-9 handler with a past few understood, kept her hands steady on the wheel of her white truck, her sharp eyes locked on the road ahead. In the truck bed behind her, 3 powerful shadows remained alert. Havoc, Brutus, and Diesel, her highly trained German shepherds, weren't just dogs. They were weapons, raised for combat, tracking, and protection. They had once fought alongside Riley in missions that left scars deeper than any bullet wound. The digital clock on the dashboard read 12:03 a.m., still 200 miles to go. But the road had different plans for her that night. A sudden glare in the rearview mirror caught Riley's attention. Headlights, small at first but growing rapidly. Motorcycles. The low, guttural roar of engines shattered the quiet night, closing in around her like a pack of wolves. They weren't just passing through. They were hunting. One of the bikers accelerated until he was right next to her window. He wore a worn-out leather vest, the faded emblem on the back barely visible. A skull wrapped in coiled snakes. The leader. His name was Dax Viper Maddox, a man with a reputation as dirty as the oil dripping from his bike. A slow smirk spread across his face. Late night for a lady to be driving all alone, don't you think? Riley didn't respond. Her grip on the steering wheel didn't tighten. Her breathing didn't change. She had been in far worse situations than this. Another biker, a massive man with gray in his beard and a mean glint in his eye, slammed his fist against the side of her truck. Roy Hatchet Calloway, the kind of man who took pleasure in making people nervous. "We're talking to you, sweetheart," he called out, his voice dripping with amusement. In the truck bed, Havoc's ears perked up, a deep growl rumbling in his throat. Brutus planted his paws firmly, ready for whatever command might come next. Diesel, the oldest and most experienced, remained perfectly still, watching, waiting, calculating. Riley knew better than to show fear, but she also knew these men weren't just messing around. Then came the hit. One of the bikers swerved hard, slamming his bike into the right side of her truck, shaking it violently. Riley clenched her jaw and steadied the wheel, regaining control before the tires could skid off the road. They were trying to force her off the highway. Adrenaline burned through her veins like wildfire. If they thought she was an easy target, they had no idea who they were dealing with. What those men didn't know was that Riley wasn't alone. And tonight, they were about to learn that the hard way. If you want to find out what happens next on this dangerous night, don't forget to leave a like. It helps us keep bringing you thrilling stories like this one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way, you won't miss a single episode of this action-packed story. Riley's truck lurched as another hit slammed into the passenger side. The tires skidded slightly before she corrected the wheel, keeping control. Her pulse was steady, her breathing even. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to force her hand. The difference was, they had no idea who they were dealing with. In the truck bed, Havoc, Brutus, and Diesel were no longer still. Their ears twitched at every rev of the engines, their eyes locked on the bikers. They could sense the tension, the aggression. They were waiting. A biker with a deep scar running down his face pulled up to her right and kicked the door hard. "Hey, sweetheart, you deaf or just plain tough?" To her left, Viper Maddox stayed right next to her window, his smirk widening. "Just pull over, darlin'. We ain't gonna hurt you. We just wanna talk." Riley didn't even glance at him. Instead, she jerked the wheel to the right, fast and sharp. The biker who had kicked her door swerved violently to avoid a full collision, his bike wobbling out of control for a few seconds before he managed to steady it. The gang erupted in curses. Viper's smile disappeared. His green eyes hardened. "All right, so that's how it's gonna be?" The pack reacts. In the back, Havoc let out a sharp bark. Brutus tensed, a low growl vibrating through his chest. Diesel's golden eyes locked on the gang. His ears flattened against his skull. They were ready. 2 more bikers sped up, moving ahead of her truck to block the road. Riley knew exactly what they were doing, forcing her to slow down, giving the others time to close in around her. Viper's voice cut through the night. "Stop the truck, lady. Last chance." Riley's foot pressed harder against the gas. She wasn't stopping. She was leading them. The trap is set. Up ahead. A sign loomed in the darkness. "Bridge, 1 lane ahead." She flicked her high beams twice. A signal. In the truck bed, Havoc's ears twitched. Diesel lowered his stance. Brutus let out a slow, deep exhale. They understood. As soon as the bridge began, Riley acted. She slammed the brakes. The sudden stop sent the closest biker flying. His tires screeched, his body slamming hard against the pavement as his bike crashed beside him. The others barely avoided piling up on top of him. Riley didn't waste a second. She threw the truck into reverse. She wasn't running. She was positioning. Then she hit park and let the dogs loose. The truck rumbled and idle, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burnt rubber and gasoline. The roar of motorcycle engines now replaced by something far more chilling: silence. Riley didn't hesitate. She reached for the latch on the tailgate, her fingers moving with muscle memory. In one swift motion, she pulled it down, the metal slamming open with a sharp clang. That was all it took. Before the gang could process what was happening, Havoc, Brutus, and Diesel launched from the truck bed like missiles. Their paws hit the pavement in unison, bodies sleek and powerful, muscles rippling beneath thick fur. No barking, no wasted movement, only pure, disciplined aggression. These weren't ordinary dogs. They were trained for war. The bikers, once so cocky and sure of themselves, suddenly looked far less confident. Brutus struck first, his massive frame colliding with one of the bikers, sending him sprawling to the ground with a heavy thud. The man barely had time to react before Brutus's jaws clamped down on his forearm, pinning him with brute force. His scream pierced the night as he struggled against the weight pressing him into the pavement. Havoc darted toward another target, his teeth snapping inches from the man's leg, forcing him to stumble backward. Diesel, always strategic, circled the remaining bikers, his sharp eyes watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Viper Maddox sat frozen on his bike, his expression shifting from amusement to something much darker. He hadn't expected this. A woman alone on the highway? An easy mark. But a trained soldier with military K9s? That changed everything. His men were scattered, panicked, backing away, their hands raised in fear. The dominance they once had over the situation had been stripped from them in seconds. Riley stepped out of the truck, her movements calm, deliberate. Her boots crunched against the asphalt, slow and measured, as if she had all the time in the world. She didn't need a gun. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her dogs were handling the problem for her. One of the bikers, the same one who had kicked her door, now lay on the ground, gasping in pain as Brutus's fangs pressed harder against his arm. She looked directly at Viper, her eyes cold and unreadable. "Still think I should pull over?" Viper's hands tightened around the handlebars of his bike. He had two choices: order his men to fight back or cut his losses and retreat. But Riley could already see it in his face. This wasn't the outcome he had planned for. The night no longer belonged to them. Viper Maddox's hands gripped the handlebars of his bike tightly, his knuckles white with tension. The situation had spiraled out of his control, and he knew it. His men, who minutes ago had been laughing, taunting, acting like they owned the road, now stood frozen, their confidence shattered. Their eyes darted between the snarling dogs and the fallen bikers, realizing too late that they had picked the wrong fight. Brutus still had his jaws clamped around the arm of the biker who had kicked Riley's truck. The man barely breathed, his face contorted in pain, too afraid to move. Havoc prowled in slow, deliberate circles, his sharp gaze locked onto every movement. Diesel, always the most calculating, remained still, his stance low, his muscles coiled like a spring. They weren't attacking wildly. They were waiting, watching, ready. Riley stood calmly in the center of the chaos. She hadn't drawn a gun, hadn't raised her voice, yet she was the one who held all the power. She didn't need to prove herself, her dogs had already done that. The remaining bikers lingered by their idling motorcycles, their bravado gone, waiting for orders that wouldn't come. Her eyes locked onto Viper, and she took a slow, measured step forward. "You made a mistake tonight." Viper's jaw clenched. He said nothing, but Riley could see it, the war in his mind. His ego told him to fight, to push back, to save face. But deep down, he knew the truth. If he escalated this, he and his men wouldn't be the ones walking away. One of his bikers, younger than the rest, with blood running down his elbow from where he'd hit the pavement, finally spoke up. "Boss? What now?" Viper exhaled slowly, his pride battling against reality. Brutus growled low and deep, reminding everyone that his teeth were still buried in flesh. The biker beneath him whimpered, his breathing uneven. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Finally, Viper raised a hand. "Let him go." Riley tilted her head slightly, unimpressed. "Try again." Viper's teeth clenched. He hated this, hated losing. The words he needed to say burned like acid in his throat. "Please." That was enough. Riley snapped her fingers once, and Brutus immediately obeyed, releasing his grip and stepping back with perfect control. The biker gasped and scrambled away, clutching his wounded arm, his hands shaking. Viper met Riley's gaze one last time. He revved his engine, the sound loud and hollow in the night. Then, without another word, he turned his bike around. One by one, the others followed, some limping, some muttering under their breath, but none of them looking back. As the red glow of their taillights faded into the distance, Riley exhaled slowly. Her dogs remained tense, watching, waiting for her command. Only when she gave a low whistle did they finally relax. Havoc was the last to move, his eyes still tracking the road where the bikers had disappeared. Riley ran a hand through Brutus's thick fur, her voice steady. "Good boys." But she knew, deep down, this wasn't the last time she'd see them. This wasn't over. The highway was silent again, but the weight of the encounter still lingered in the air. Riley stood next to her truck, her eyes locked on the stretch of road where the gang had vanished. The hum of her engine filled the empty space, steady and unshaken, just like her. But something about the night still felt wrong. Too quiet, too expectant, like the fight hadn't really ended. Havoc, Brutus, and Diesel remained alert. Their muscles weren't tense like before, but none of them had relaxed. Diesel's ears flicked at every distant sound, his sharp gaze scanning the dark horizon. Brutus stood close to Riley's side, his thick chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths, ready for anything. Havoc sat near the truck bed, his golden eyes locked on the road, unblinking, as if he could sense something she couldn't. And maybe he could. Reaching into the cab, Riley grabbed a bottle of water and took a slow sip. Her body was calm, but her mind was already working through every possible scenario. This wasn't over. Viper Maddox wasn't the kind of man to take a loss quietly. He had retreated tonight, but she had no doubt he was already thinking about his next move. Next time, he wouldn't come in reckless. He'd be calculated, smarter, and that made him more dangerous. She glanced down at Brutus, running a hand over his thick fur. "What do you think, boy? You think he's done?" Brutus didn't react, didn't look up at her. He just kept staring at the road, silent. And Riley knew that was her answer. Then, in the distance, a flicker of light. Riley straightened, her pulse steady, but her instincts sharpening. Headlights. Too far to tell if it was just another traveler passing through or something else. But something about them felt wrong. The speed, the movement, too slow, too careful. Havoc let out a low, rumbling growl. Diesel shifted his stance, muscles coiling beneath his thick coat, ready to lunge if needed. Riley didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon. Not yet. She just stood there, watching. Then, just as suddenly as the lights had appeared, they shut off. The road was dark again. Riley exhaled, slow and measured. A message. He wasn't done. He was letting her know. He was still watching. She turned back to her truck and gave a sharp whistle. The dogs reacted instantly, jumping back into the truck bed, their eyes still fixed on the road. They didn't trust the silence either. As Riley climbed into the driver's seat, she gripped the wheel a little tighter, her jaw set. Let him watch. With a smooth shift of gears, the truck rolled back onto the highway, headlights piercing through the darkness. If Viper wanted another fight, he'd get one. What would you do in this situation? Tell us in the comments. We want to know your opinion. The truck moved steadily down the highway, the hum of the engine blending with the endless stretch of darkness ahead. Riley's hands stayed firm on the wheel, but her mind was moving faster than the vehicle itself. Something wasn't right. The tension from earlier still clung to the air, thick and heavy, refusing to fade. She could feel it, creeping along the edges of her instincts like a shadow that refused to be shaken. In the truck bed, Havoc, Brutus, and Diesel remained motionless but far from relaxed. Their ears twitched at the subtle sounds of the night, their sharp eyes scanning the road behind them. They knew, just like Riley, they could sense when something wasn't over. And this wasn't over. She kept her focus ahead, but her instincts tugged her toward the mirror. Something flickered in the distance, just a brief glint, metal catching the moonlight. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable against the vast blackness of the open highway. But then it shifted. A pair of headlights appeared on the horizon, far behind her. At this hour, in this part of the country, traffic was rare. The last car she had seen was miles ago, and yet this one was there. Her pulse remained steady, but her grip on the wheel tightened slightly. A coincidence? Maybe, but Riley didn't believe in coincidences. She adjusted her speed, easing off the gas just enough to test a theory. The headlights adjusted too. Not a coincidence. Riley exhaled slowly, her mind clicking into place like a loaded weapon. Whoever was back there was watching her, tracking her, waiting. The question wasn't if they were following, it was why. Brutus lifted his head, his ears twitching. Diesel's posture stiffened, his golden eyes locked on the road behind them. Havoc, the most experienced, didn't move, but he was watching, calculating, waiting for Riley's command. She weighed her options carefully. If it was Viper, he wouldn't be sneaky. He wasn't the type to lurk in the dark. If he wanted revenge, he'd make sure she saw him coming. This was someone else. And that meant one thing, whoever it was, they didn't want to be seen. Riley flexed her fingers once, her breathing slow, measured. She had spent too many years in combat zones to ignore signs like this. She knew what it meant to be hunted. The open road stretched ahead, silent and empty. The headlights behind her held their position, lingering just at the edge of visibility. Not gaining, not falling back. Just waiting. Her lips pressed into a thin line. All right, if they wanted to follow her, that was fine. But if they thought she was an easy target, they were about to learn otherwise. The truck rumbled steadily down the dark highway, but the weight in Riley's chest only grew heavier. The headlights behind her hadn't disappeared. They stayed at a steady distance, never closing in, never falling too far back. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a tale. Havoc, Brutus, and Diesel were completely still, but their eyes were locked on the rear of the truck. They could sense the shift in Riley's energy, the slight tension in her hands, the way her breathing had changed. They had been trained to recognize danger before it even revealed itself. Riley's mind raced through possibilities. Viper Maddox? Maybe, but it didn't fit his style. If he wanted to retaliate, he wouldn't be lurking in the shadows. He'd be loud. He'd be messy. He'd want her to see him coming. This was different. Whoever was back there was waiting for something. Watching. Her fingers tapped lightly against the wheel as she considered her next move. She could test them. See how much they wanted this. She eased off the gas, letting the truck slow. For a moment, the headlights behind her hesitated. Then they slowed too. Her jaw tightened. Definitely not a coincidence. She pressed the gas again, picking up speed. The vehicle behind her adjusted, matching her pace. They weren't trying to pass. They weren't just another driver on the road. They were locked onto her. Brutus let out a low, guttural growl, his thick muscles shifting beneath his fur. Diesel's ears twitched as he stared into the darkness. Havoc, always the most disciplined, didn't make a sound. But Riley saw the way his shoulders tensed, the way his breathing deepened. They were waiting for her signal. Riley took a slow breath, keeping her heartbeat steady. If they wanted to follow her, that was fine. But they were about to find out they had made a mistake. She flicked her eyes to the side mirror, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, she hit the brakes. Hard. The moment Riley slammed the brakes, the truck's tires screeched against the pavement, the sudden force pulling her forward against the seatbelt. The vehicle behind her had no time to react. Headlights flared brighter as it closed in fast, tires screeching in desperation. Whoever was tailing her hadn't expected this move. At the last second, the driver swerved violently to avoid impact, their vehicle fishtailing before skidding to a shaky stop a few yards back. For the first time, Riley had the upper hand. The hunter had just become the hunted. In the truck bed, Havoc, Brutus, and Diesel exploded into action. Brutus lunged toward the edge, his deep growl rumbling through the night. Diesel's golden eyes gleamed in the glow of the taillights, his posture low and ready. Havoc, always the strategist, remained still, waiting for the command. Riley's fingers tightened around the gear shift, her pulse steady. She wasn't afraid. She was in control. The other vehicle remained still, its engine idling. Tinted windows concealed the driver. They weren't moving. They weren't leaving. They were watching. Riley's patience thinned. She wasn't about to sit around and wait for them to make the first move. She was done playing games. Reaching down, she tapped twice on the dashboard. A signal. Instantly, Havoc let out a single, sharp bark. Diesel tensed. Brutus's growl deepened. The message was clear. Riley wasn't alone. The other vehicle's engine suddenly roared to life. Tires spun against the pavement as the driver threw it into reverse, retreating into the darkness. Within seconds, the taillights disappeared into the night. Riley exhaled, watching the dust settle. Cowards. Brutus let out one final growl before settling back. Diesel kept watching the road. But Havoc, always the most perceptive, kept his eyes on Riley. She tightened her grip on the wheel. Whoever they were, this wasn't the last time they'd cross her path. And next time, she wouldn't let them run. The road ahead was nothing but an endless stretch of darkness, the occasional highway marker reflecting in Riley's headlights as she drove. The truck hummed steadily beneath her hands, but her mind was moving faster than the engine. Whoever had been following her was gone. For now. But her instincts screamed that it wasn't over. Someone out there had chosen her as their target. The question was, why? In the truck bed, Havoc, Brutus, and Diesel had settled, but none of them had truly relaxed. Diesel lay stretched out, his golden eyes barely open, his ears flicking at even the slightest noise. Brutus rested his head on his paws, but Riley could tell by his slow, steady breathing that he wasn't asleep, just waiting. And Havoc, as always, sat perfectly still, his muscles coiled beneath thick fur, his gaze locked on the road behind them. They could feel it just like she could. The tension, the unease, the fight that wasn't finished. She shifted her grip on the steering wheel, rolling her shoulders back. Viper Maddox didn't have the patience to send someone after her like this. If he wanted revenge, he'd make sure she saw him coming. He'd want her to know. Whoever had been tailing her tonight wasn't playing that kind of game. They were patient, careful. They wanted to study her first, and that made them even more dangerous. The gas station was still 20 miles away. She debated whether she should stop or keep going, but she already knew the answer. If she was being hunted, she needed to control the battlefield. Stopping gave her the chance to assess, to see if whoever was following her would make a mistake. 15 miles. Brutus suddenly lifted his head. His ears perked up, his deep brown eyes reflecting in the mirror as he met Riley's gaze. He knew something was off, just like she did. Riley gave him a slight nod, acknowledging what he already understood. 10 miles. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Riley's fingers instinctively twitched against the wheel. Another traveler? Or something else? She wasn't sure yet, but she had learned long ago that it was better to assume the worst and be wrong than to assume the best and be dead. 5 miles. The gas station came into view, its flickering fluorescent lights cutting through the night. It was small, just a single pump, a rundown convenience store, and an old truck parked near the side. There was no movement, no sign of life, but that didn't mean no one was there. Riley pulled in, cutting the engine. The second the truck stopped moving, Havoc, Brutus, and Diesel were back on full alert. They didn't make a sound, but they were ready, just like she was. She stepped out of the truck, inhaling deeply as the night air wrapped around her. The silence stretched, thick and expectant. The feeling in her gut hadn't faded. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, and soon she'd find out exactly who. The gas station was deathly quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above the cracked pavement. Riley stood by her truck, her breath slow and steady, her senses tuned to every inch of her surroundings. The old truck parked near the side hadn't moved, but that didn't mean it was empty. She could feel it, the presence of someone nearby, watching, waiting. In the truck bed, Havoc, Brutus, and Diesel remained perfectly still, their bodies tense, eyes locked onto the darkness beyond the gas pumps. They sensed it too. They were trained to recognize danger before it revealed itself. And right now, every instinct they had was telling them they weren't alone. Riley's fingers hovered near her belt, close to the knife she always carried. She didn't need a gun to be dangerous. She had been trained to fight with her hands, with her mind. And if this was the moment her pursuer decided to show themselves, she'd be ready. The convenience store door creaked open. A figure stepped out. Riley's stance didn't change, but her pulse ticked higher. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if testing the space between them. Not reckless, not aggressive, just watching. She didn't recognize him. Not one of Viper's men. Not a drifter just passing through. So who the hell was he? The man stopped just outside the pool of light from the gas station. Close enough to see her, but not close enough for her to see him clearly. "You drive smart," he said finally, his voice calm, even, measured. Riley didn't respond. She wasn't about to play whatever game he was starting. He tilted his head slightly. "K9S military trained. You're not just a trucker, are you?" Her expression remained unreadable. She didn't ask questions she already knew the answers to. And this man? He already knew exactly who she was. Diesel let out a low growl. The man didn't flinch. "Relax," he murmured, lifting his hands slightly. "If I wanted trouble, I would have already caused it." Riley's jaw tightened. "Then why are you following me?" For a moment, the man just looked at her, studying, calculating. Then, finally, he gave a small smirk. "Because you're not the only one Viper Maddox has a problem with." The night stretched silent between them. Riley exhaled slowly. The pieces were starting to fall into place. She wasn't being hunted. She was being recruited. Chapter 10, Face to Face. The gas station was wrapped in an unsettling quiet. The hum of flickering neon lights the only sound in the heavy night air. Riley stood by her truck, her breath controlled, her posture relaxed, but every muscle in her body was ready. She wasn't fooled by the stillness. She could feel it, that tension just beneath the surface, that electric charge in the air when something wasn't quite right. She wasn't alone. In the truck bed, Havoc, Brutus, and Diesel were locked in position, their bodies perfectly still, their ears twitching at the faintest sound. They didn't bark, didn't snarl, but their eyes stayed fixed on the dark edges of the lot. They weren't just trained to attack. They were trained to sense a threat before it revealed itself. And right now, everything in their stance told Riley exactly what she already knew. Someone was here, watching, waiting. Her fingers rested near her belt, close to the knife she always carried. She didn't need a gun to be lethal. She had learned long ago that weapons weren't what made someone dangerous. Mindset, control, the willingness to do what others wouldn't. That's what made the difference between predator and prey. Then the moment arrived. A door creaked open. The dull glow from the convenience store spilled out as a man stepped into the light. Riley's expression didn't change, but her pulse slowed, steady, measured. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothes that blended into the night. His walk was deliberate, not hesitant, not rushed, just controlled, like he was testing the space between them. She didn't know him, not one of Viper Maddox's men, not some lost traveler stopping for gas. So who the hell was he? He stopped just outside the brightest part of the lights, far enough that the details of his face remained in shadow. A calculated choice. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, "You drive smart." His voice was calm, steady, measured. Riley didn't respond. She wasn't about to play his game. He studied her, head tilting slightly. K9S military trained. "You're not just a truck driver, are you?" She still said nothing. If he wanted answers, he was going to have to give some first. Diesel let out a low, vibrating growl. The man didn't react, didn't shift, didn't even blink. "Relax," he murmured, lifting his hands slightly in a mock surrender. "If I wanted a fight, we'd already be in one." Riley's jaw tightened. "Then why are you following me?" A beat of silence. Then the smallest smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Because you're not the only one Viper Maddox has unfinished business with." The night stretched thick between them, heavy with the weight of something bigger than this moment. Riley exhaled, slow and steady. The pieces were falling into place. She hadn't been hunted. She had been chosen. If you enjoyed this action-packed story, don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps the channel grow and brings even more thrilling stories your way. Make sure to subscribe. Click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new suspense-filled, adrenaline-pumping story. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Riley's place? Comment below and let's talk about it. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.